How did Joseph Smith's electoral activities fit into the broader political culture of early America? My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American religion and a historian of Mormonism. And recently, there's been a lot of attention on the relationship between church and state, especially in the wake of the Donald Trump administration announcing that they are no longer going to be enforcing the rules that kept religious churches and clergy from endorsing political candidates, a topic I've already done a video on. So many people are curious how this fits within the Mormon context, or rather, how do Mormons fit into the long history of church and state? So what I'm going to do, starting with this video, is a series of videos every Monday on Mormonism and the state, and Mormonism and partisan politics. Every Monday, I'll be uploading a video covering from the Joseph Smith era to the present, and we're kicking off with this one, in which I'll discuss why Joseph Smith challenged the political culture of his day and how that played a role in his eventual death. Let's dig in. But first, we need a little bit of context. Now, while we take disestablishment, which is a scholarly term for the separation of church and state, mostly for granted now, though that's of course being challenged, it was an experiment during the early decades after America won her independence from Britain. The ability for religions to function and thrive in a free marketplace of ideas opened up new opportunities and pitfalls, and many different churches approach the topics of politics quite differently. In general, however, there was a sentiment that while religion was going to frame many people's political activities, there had to be a separation between clergy and religious leaders and politicians or electoral office. Because if religious authorities were telling their congregants how to vote, that would be an infringement upon what was called the individual conscience, that American democracy had to flourish by people operating on their own free will and in their own agency. Now, one of the reasons they did this was America was largely a Protestant culture, which eschewed the idea of ecclesiastical control. And there was a bit of a quasi-establishment of the Protestants who were able to control politics, and those marginalized were often punished, including the Catholics and then eventually the Mormons. Now, when Joseph Smith founded the Mormon tradition in the 1830s, politics weren't at the forefront of his agenda. His earliest revelations did not seem to recognize a secular state or talk about America in general, though after they started having problems in Missouri, he started referencing the Constitution as a divinely inspired document, a definition that would evolve over the years. But the big moment that turns Joseph Smith and the Mormons' attention to partisan politics, and especially electoral politics, was when they were kicked out of Missouri. Because with a governor, an elected governor, Lilburn Boggs, and the party in charge of Missouri, the Democrats, supporting the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints, going so far as issuing an extermination order saying the Latter-day Saints must be either exterminated or driven from the state, that led Mormons to realize that they were going to have to play a political game in order to survive. And so when the Mormons found themselves on the banks of the Mississippi River in Illinois and what came to be Nauvoo, they were ready for a change. By the way, if you enjoyed this type of content, geeking out about history and why it is so important for the present, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Every Monday, I do deep dives on a historical topic. Wednesday, I connect the past to the present. And on Fridays, I tell you more about the historiography behind the most important works that can give you context for the world in which we inhabit. All right, let's get back to the history. To understand the Mormon politicking that took place in Nauvoo, Illinois, a topic that was at the center of a book I wrote, Kingdom Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, you have to understand both the national and the state context. Nationally, Joseph Smith and a number of delegates from the church went to Washington, D.C. to petition for redress given how the state of Illinois treated them. But the general sentiment, both from President Martin Van Buren as well as Congress, was that that was a state's issue. This was a time of limited federal control and oversight, and most authority was at the state level. And so Joseph Smith and the Mormons learned from that national context that they were going to have to play the game at the state level. And in the state context, it made it especially conducive for Mormons to take advantage, because Illinois in the 1840s was what we today call a swing state, meaning that the Whig Party and the Democrat Party, the two primary parties during the era, were pretty equal in vying for power over the state, which meant that when the Mormons arrived with their thousands of converts, both political parties were anxious to win their support. And so Joseph Smith and the Mormons, realizing from their past experiences, they had to be able to court these politicians. So they embark on what scholars call block voting, meaning that they are going to block all their votes together to support one candidate that they feel will represent their interests. And what's remarkable about the story is how eager the politicians were to play along with this game, which I guess is probably not too surprising given we know how politicians operate now. But every year, whenever there was a municipal or county or state election, these politicians would try to court the Mormon votes, and the Mormons were good at consolidating their support for whatever candidate could promise that they will watch out for the Mormons. And then Joseph Smith would go in front of the saints at a general conference or publish an editorial saying, I believe that X candidate for X party is a friend of the saints, and I encourage people to vote for him. And they were remarkably successful at this. Let me give you one example of what this block voting looked like. In advance of the August 1842 election, Joseph Smith speaks with both gubernatorial candidates, issues his support eventually for Thomas Ford, the Democratic candidate, makes that endorsement known in the newspapers. And then when August 1st comes around, the day that the vote happened for the state of Illinois, at least one of the precincts in Nauvoo took place in Hiram Smith's own office, where it is likely Joseph and Hiram were hanging out. And voting back then was quite different than voting now. This wasn't a secret ballot vote. You would go in and you would tell the voting clerk who you are voting for. And here is an image from those voting rolls in August 1842, which shows that all Mormons voted in unison with what their leaders told them. Of the 457 people that voted in that particular precinct in Nauvoo, only 11 did not follow the particular pattern. So Mormons tried to present themselves as amenable to both political candidates and political parties. It was more going on pragmatic reasons, something that has a long history in America of groups consolidating their votes to support certain candidates. I often frame it when it comes down to political principles that Mormons did not have a consistent political ideology. Rather, it was all about friendships and relationships and allegiances. In general, Mormons were more likely to support Whig policies, but they often aligned with the Democrats culturally, which were the group often more about the common man and democratic control, which many Mormons seem to support, at least at the moment. And then in Nauvoo itself, there was a direct merging of church and state because people like Joseph Smith not only held ecclesiastical leadership positions, but he was also the mayor, the postmaster. He held a number of significant secular duties that really startled their neighbors. That reaction from Nauvoo's neighbors is worth dwelling on for a moment, because those outside of Nauvoo saw this politicking as the very type of church and state interrelationship that the nation seemed to abolish. This was a flagrant disregard of the individual conscience, that the same man who had control of their salvation and exaltation is telling the Latter-day Saints how to vote. This is how they saw it operating. And so you had lots of people expressing their consternation, their disgust in newspapers, saying that the Mormons were no longer acting like a religious body, they were acting as a political body, and therefore they were not due the rights and privileges of a religious organization. At one point, very early on, by 1841, non-Mormon residents of Hancock County, where Nauvoo was located, created an anti-Mormon party. That's what they called it, the anti-Mormon party, because they believed that they were becoming a minority in the county with the Mormons and their growing number of voters in control of all local politicians. And all these fears seemed to come to a crisis in August of 1843, an election where Joseph Smith promised support to one party, ended up switching it to the other, and both political parties and the county at large lost faith that the Mormons were good faith actors. Maybe I'll do a video at some point on the August 1843 election, because I really do believe it is the hinge point that resulted in the Mormons' eventual expulsion from Nauvoo. Once Mormons had burned their bridges with the political parties who were no longer willing to work with them after August 1843, Mormons didn't take a step back. Joseph Smith didn't take a moment to pause. Instead, they continued to push forward, escalating things to even more radical actions. Publicly, Joseph Smith announced his campaign for the presidency. He had his own national platform published in a campaign book where it was an odd mix of political ideas. This is an example of what I mean when I say that Joseph Smith and the early Mormons did not have a consistent political ideology. Joseph Smith said that Andrew Jackson was the best president America had ever had, kind of an example of this democratic ethos that many Mormons had bought into. And yet in his campaign pamphlet, he called for a national bank, the very thing that Andrew Jackson hated, just to show that this was not a whole politically consistent position. He also called for the annexation of Texas. He called for the sale of public lands in order to pay off enslavers to liberate African Americans who would then migrate somewhere else. But most importantly, Joseph Smith's primary political argument was that he wanted a strengthening of the federal government. He believed that states, with good reason, given their history, could no longer be trusted to protect the rights of those marginalized like the Mormons, which is why he argued that Congress should be as powerful in the federal government as Jehovah is powerful in a religious sphere. That's a language he used. In fact, he corresponded with several of the presidential candidates, and he rebuffed their arguments that the federal government should not get involved. He said the federal government is the only thing that can preserve the rights of these minority and marginalized groups, a position that the government does not take until the Reconstruction Amendments following the Civil War. Another primary argument of Joseph Smith's political campaign was this idea of blending revelatory authority with electoral politics. Here is an image from one of his campaign literature. It shows God's voice speaking from the heavens, and it used the Latin phrase super hunc petrum audificabo. I know I butchered that, which is basically the first half of the New Testament scripture of upon this rock I will build my church, although it takes off I will build my church, implying that this rock of revelation of priesthood authority is now going to be used for government. This is a direct merging of church and state, a principle that is also found in his organization of the Council of 50 around the same time, which rewrote the Constitution, provided a new Constitution. Maybe I'll do a video at some point specifically on the Council of 50. But what's notable is that in that Council of 50 was a critique of secular democratic politics, saying that only God's voice and a strong centralized authority can restore unity and stability and freedom to the world. And you start getting this language in the Council of 50 records of a distrust of democracy, that the voice of the people can only work when they are following the voice of God. Now, Joseph Smith is killed in Carthage jail before the 1844 election, but I do want to note a few things of the connection of the martyrdom and his presidential campaign. First, no one really thought Joseph Smith had a chance to win outside of Joseph Smith and the Mormons. Sometimes you'll hear this conspiracy that there was concern that Joseph Smith might have this outside chance to be a dark horse candidate. That's nonsense. He had no chance in the presidential election. Most commentators did not view his campaign as a threat, but rather a joke. And the only threatening aspect of his campaign was the megalomania that seemed to go with his presidential aspirations. So I don't think there was any political conspiracy to kill Joseph Smith on political grounds. Second, One of the great ironies of the story is Joseph Smith becomes the first person in American history to be assassinated while a presidential candidate, something that only a handful of people can claim. In summary, Joseph Smith's political views and the Mormons' political agitation and actions in Nauvoo is a fascinating story because it's a glimpse of the democratic system failing. Both the Mormons and those who despise the Mormons no longer believe that electoral politics works, that democracy was too fragile, and that's why you had to find some extra legal measure for redress. There's also some lasting legacies that come out of this. The episode in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith eventually being killed and the political parties not being willing to step in to support the Mormons, is going to cast a long shadow over Mormon activity for generations afterward, which again is going to be the topic of my future videos on Mondays digging into Mormonism and politics. I hope this video was helpful. I hope you enjoyed it and might have even learned something new. If so, please like the video and share it with others, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. History has never been more relevant because these topics are not just fascinating, but they help us understand how our community came to be. And it makes it all the more important that we continue this digging and dialogue and discussion and connecting these historical episodes with our current world.